You know, there's a certain sound a champagne flute makes when it's truly full. It's not a clink, not a clang. It's a deep, resonant chime that seems to hang in the air, a perfect, crystalline note of prosperity. Tonight, the grand ballroom of the Intercontinental Chicago was filled with that sound, hundreds of them, a symphony of success. And at the center of it all was my father, Richard Davenport, a man who looked like he was carved from the very marble of the columns holding up the ceiling. He was born to be in rooms like this, under the warm glow of chandeliers, accepting the accolades of men who wished they were him. I stood near the back, by a ridiculously ornate floral arrangement, the scent of lilies thick and cloying. I was wearing a navy blue dress, simple and elegant, modest, the kind of dress a daughter wears when her purpose is to be an accessory to her father's greatness. I was Juliet Davenport, junior analyst, the quiet one, the good one, the one who got his brains, but thankfully her mother's temperament. I'd heard that a million times. He'd pat my head, even now, with me being 26 years old, and tell his friends, "She's my rock, steady and loyal." He had no idea that the rock was about to start an avalanche. He saw me as his legacy, the one who would carry the Davenport name with quiet dignity. He never once suspected I was also the Sentinel. The Sentinel was the name I'd given myself on the encrypted messages. It sounded dramatic, I know, something out of a comic book, but in the dead of night, with the weight of what I was doing pressing down on me, it felt right. A sentinel stands watch. A sentinel sees what others don't, and for the past 6 months I had been watching my father's empire from the inside, meticulously documenting the rot at its core and feeding it, piece by agonizing piece, to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The evidence was irrefutable, a mountain of spreadsheets, falsified trade logs, and phantom accounts that proved Davenport Capital wasn't an investment firm, it was a lie. A massive, glittering Ponzi scheme built on the backs of hundreds of small investors, teachers, firefighters, retirees, people who had trusted my father with their entire lives. Tonight was the company's annual awards gala, the grand finale. My father was the guest of honor, set to receive the Chicago Financial Guild's Lifetime Achievement Award. The irony was so thick I could taste it, bitter and metallic. Under the sweetness of the champagne I was only pretending to sip. In approximately 45 minutes, just as he would be waxing poetic about integrity and trust, his two favorite words, 2 men and 1 woman from the FBI's white-collar crime division were going to walk through the main doors. They weren't going to be subtle. They were going to walk right up to the stage, and they were going to arrest Richard Davenport mid-speech, in front of his wife, his peers, and the press. And no one, not my mother, not our family, not a single person in this glittering, oblivious room would ever know that it was his own daughter, his quiet, loyal rock, who brought him down. It wasn't about revenge, I told myself, for the thousandth time, it was about justice. But as I watched him take the stage, a charming, predatory smile on his face, I had to admit, a part of me was starting to wonder if there was even a difference. The moment it all began wasn't dramatic. There was no thunderclap, no sudden, cinematic revelation. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 6 months ago, under the flat, humming fluorescent lights of my cubicle on the 42nd floor. I was a junior analyst, which was a fancy title for a glorified data entry clerk who was allowed to sit in on important meetings, as long as I didn't speak. My job was grunt work, reconciling accounts, cross-referencing trade confirmations, the digital equivalent of sweeping the floors. My father believed in starting at the bottom. He said it built character. What it really built was a comprehensive, ground-level view of his entire operation. He thought he was teaching me humility. What he was really giving me was a map of his crimes. That afternoon, I was working on a quarterly reconciliation for a fund I'd never heard of before, the Rosewood Portfolio. It wasn't on any of the official client lists. It was just a line item on an internal transfer ledger, but the numbers were odd. Millions of dollars were flowing into it from dozens of smaller individual client accounts, but almost nothing was flowing out in the form of investment purchases. Money came in, and it just sat there, before being transferred out again in lump sums to a holding company I also didn't recognize. My first thought was that it was a mistake, a typo. I felt a small, familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach. The last thing I wanted was to point out an error and have my father look at me with that patient, disappointed smile he reserved for when I was being slow on the uptake. I spent an hour digging, then 2. I pulled the source data for the incoming transfers. The names attached to the accounts were not our usual clientele. These weren't corporations or hedge funds, they were people. A retired librarian from Naperville, a mechanic from the South Side, a widow whose husband had been a police officer. Their life savings, their pensions, their futures, all trickling into this one mysterious, stagnant pool of money. The knot in my stomach tightened, turning cold. I traced the holding company that the money was flowing out to. It was a shell corporation, a ghost, and the listed director, the sole signature portive in the portive, Ritura Davenport, my father. I felt the blood drain from my face. The hum of the office lights seemed to grow louder, oppressive. I looked out of my little cubicle, across the vast, open-plan office. I could see my father in his glass-walled corner office, on the phone, laughing about something. He gestured with his hands, expansive and confident. The man who taught me how to ride a bike. The man who quizzed me on the stock market at the dinner table since I was 12. The man who told me that a Davenport's word was their bond. I felt a wave of nausea, so intense I had to grip the edge of my desk. It couldn't be. It was a misunderstanding. There had to be a rational, legal explanation. A special fund for preferred clients, maybe. A tax strategy I wasn't sophisticated enough to understand. But I was my father's daughter. He trained me to see patterns, to respect the data above all else. And the data was screaming at me. This wasn't an investment strategy. This was theft. He was using new investors' money to pay dividends to older ones, creating the illusion of impossible returns, while siphoning off millions for himself. It was the oldest, cruelest trick in the book, a Ponzi scheme. My father, the titan of industry, the pillar of the community, was a common thief dressed in a $2,000 suit. In that moment, something inside me broke. The carefully constructed image of my father, the hero of my entire life, didn't just crack. It shattered into a million pieces, and all that was left were the jagged, ugly edges of the truth. That was the inciting incident. That was the day the quiet, loyal daughter died, and the Sentinel began to wake up. The first 48 hours after the discovery were a blur of managed panic. I went home to my small apartment in Lincoln Park, and I was physically sick. I threw up twice, my body trying to expel a truth that my mind couldn't handle. I remember sitting on the cold tile of my bathroom floor, shaking, replaying every memory I had of my father through this new horrifying lens. Every lecture about integrity, every speech about building a legacy, it was all a performance, a meticulously crafted lie. I had spent my entire life looking up to a man who didn't exist. The grief was dizzying. It felt like he had died, but it was worse because he was still alive, still smiling, still calling me Jules, and asking if I'd finished the quarterly reports. My entire childhood felt like a fraud. I remembered being 13, so proud, when my father sponsored my Little League team. He'd bought us the best uniforms, all emblazoned with the Davenport Capital logo. He'd given us a pep talk before the championship game, telling us that winning was about playing with honor. I remember how his words made my chest swell with pride. Now the memory made my stomach churn. That honor was paid for with stolen money. I thought about Mrs. Gable, the retired librarian from Naperville, whose name I'd seen in the Rosewood file. Had her $100,000 investment, her life savings, paid for our uniforms, for the pizza party after we lost. The thought was so vile, I had to choke back another wave of nausea. My father had always cultivated this image of himself as a tough but fair patriarch. He believed in merit, or so he said, but his version of merit was skewed. I was the quiet, academic one, the one who had to work twice as hard for his approval. My older brother, Evan, was the golden child. He wasn't in finance, he was a creative consultant in California, which was a nice way of saying he was a 30-year-old aspiring influencer who my father funded. Evan could do no wrong. His failed startups were learning experiences. His extravagant trips were networking. When I graduated from the University of Chicago with honors in economics, my father shook my hand and said, "Good, now the real work begins." When Evan posted a picture of himself on a yacht in Monaco, my father shared it with all his friends with the caption, "My boy, living the dream." He was loud, he was charming, he was the son my father could show off. I was the daughter he put to work. This dynamic, which had been a source of quiet resentment my whole life, now seemed like a part of the same pathology. Evan was part of the glittering facade. I was part of the engine room, meant to keep things running, and never ever look too closely at the fuel source. The breakdown lasted for 2 days. I called in sick to work, something I had never done before. I sat in my apartment, the blinds drawn, surrounded by darkness. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I just kept replaying the data in my head, the names, the numbers. I felt trapped. What was I supposed to do? Go to him, confront him? I could already picture it. The disappointment in his eyes, the calm, patronizing tone he would use to explain it all away. He'd tell me I was young, that I didn't understand the complexities of high finance. He'd tell me I was being emotional, hysterical even. He would twist it, manipulate me, make me feel small and stupid and ashamed for ever doubting him. And the most terrifying part was, I knew it might work. His power over me was that absolute. He had spent 26 years building the psychological cage I lived in. Then there was my mother, Eleanor. She was a master of willful ignorance. Her entire world, her social standing, her charity boards, her friendships, was built upon the foundation of my father's success. She lived in the penthouse, she wore the jewels, she hosted the parties. Her job was to not ask questions. To question my father would be to risk all of that. I knew if I went to her, she would side with him instantly. She wouldn't even hear me out. She would tell me I was being disloyal, ungrateful. She would say, "Your father has given us everything. How dare you?" The family would close ranks around him, and I would be cast out, the hysteric, who tried to ruin everything. The thought of being so utterly alone was paralyzing. The turning point, the thing that finally broke me out of my despair, came on the third day. I forced myself to go back into the office. I couldn't run from it. I had to know more. I had to know the scale of it. I told myself I was just going to confirm, to make absolutely sure before I didn't even know what. Late that afternoon, when most people had left, I went back into the Rosewood file. I felt like a spy in my own life, my heart hammering against my ribs with every click of the mouse. And that's when I found the detailed client intake forms. He kept meticulous records, a testament to his own arrogance. He never thought anyone would find them, or have the nerve to look. I clicked on a file, belonging to a couple, the Hendersons. They were both retired public school teachers. There was a photo of them attached, a smiling older couple standing in front of a small neat-looking house. In the notes section, my father had written a summary of his meeting with them. Sold their home in the city to downsize, it read, investing the full proceeds. Their entire nest egg, explicitly stated this is for their grandchildren's college education and their own long-term care. Very trusting. Prime candidates. Prime candidates. The words hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just clinical, it was predatory. He saw their trust as a vulnerability to be exploited. He saw their life's work as fuel for his machine. And then I scrolled down and saw the amount. $475,000. Everything they had. I looked at their smiling faces, and I thought about my father's casual cruelty, his dismissal of them as prime candidates. And in that moment, the grief and the fear curdled into something else, something cold and hard and clear. It was a diamond of pure, righteous rage. It wasn't about my father's betrayal of me anymore. It wasn't about the lies he'd told, or the role he'd forced me to play. This was about the Hendersons. It was about Mrs. Gable, the librarian. It was about the mechanic, and the widow and the hundreds of other people whose faces I'd never see, but whose lives my father was systematically dismantling. He had used their trust as a weapon against them. He had built our family's comfortable, privileged life on a foundation of their ruin. My loyalty, I realized, didn't belong to him. It never had. It belonged to them, the people he called prime candidates. That night, I went home, but I didn't cry. I sat down at my laptop, and I started a new document, a secure encrypted file. I titled it Project Sentinel. The fear was still there, a cold hum beneath my skin, but the resolve was stronger. He was not going to get away with it. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I knew I would not be the one to stay silent. The period of mourning was over. It was time to go to war, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that startled me, it wasn't about revenge, it was about doing the right thing. But as I started to outline the first steps of his destruction, a small dark part of my soul whispered back, maybe it could be about both. The decision to act was one thing, figuring out how was another entirely. I was an analyst, not a secret agent. I knew my father, I knew his business, but I didn't know the first thing about taking down a criminal enterprise from the inside.
My first instinct, to just walk into an FBI office with a stack of papers, was quickly dismissed. I knew my father. He was powerful. He had friends in high places, politicians he golfed with, judges he donated to. If I just came forward as Juliet Davenport, his daughter, I'd be dismissed as a disgruntled child. He would paint me as unstable, emotional, vindictive. He would bury me in legal fees and use his army of lawyers to discredit every single piece of evidence I had. I couldn't just be a witness. I had to be a ghost. I had to build a case so airtight, so overwhelming, that by the time they knew a threat existed, the walls would already be crumbling.
That's where Marcus came in. Marcus was my best friend from college. We'd survived 4 years of UChicago economics together, bonded by late-night study sessions and a shared, deeply cynical sense of humor. He was now a cybersecurity architect for a major tech firm downtown, a genuine genius who thought in code and saw systems where the rest of us saw chaos. If anyone could help me become a ghost, it was him, but I couldn't tell him everything. I couldn't put him at risk or burden him with the full, ugly truth about my father. I called him and asked him to meet me for a drink at a dive bar in Wicker Park, miles away from our usual haunts. I was a nervous wreck, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my glass. I gave him a heavily edited version of the story. I told him I'd stumbled upon some serious financial misconduct at my firm, that a senior partner was cooking the books and stealing from clients. I never said it was my father. I framed it as a moral crisis. I needed to get the information to the authorities, I told him, but I was terrified of retaliation. I needed to do it anonymously, securely, and in a way that could never be traced back to me. Marcus listened, his expression growing more and more serious as I spoke. He didn't ask a lot of prying questions. He just watched me, and I could see the gears turning in his head. When I was finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that solidified our alliance forever. My grandparents, he said, his voice low. They lost almost everything 10 years ago. Some slick real estate developer in Arizona sold them on a retirement community that was never built. He just took the deposits and vanished. They had to sell their house. My grandpa had to go back to work as a greeter at a big box store. He died 2 years later. My grandma always said the shame of it killed him faster than the cancer did. He looked me straight in the eye, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of that same cold, hard rage that I had felt. These people, he said, they don't just steal money, they steal people's dignity, they steal their futures. So yeah, I'll help you. Whatever you need, let's burn him to the ground. His personal story, his own family's brush with this kind of predatory evil, turned him from a friend helping me out into a co-conspirator. It was our subplot, the quiet, shared anger that fueled the main mission. He didn't need to know it was my father, he just needed to know it was the same kind of monster. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus became my cue. He built what he called the Sentinel's toolbox. It was a masterpiece of paranoia. He gave me a burner laptop and a set of encrypted USB drives. He set me up with a layered VPN and a secure anonymous email service that routed through servers in 3 different countries. He taught me about digital hygiene, how to erase my tracks, how to avoid detection by the firm's IT security, how to create a digital persona that was completely divorced from Juliet Davenport. We established a dead drop system for communication. I would leave him notes on a specific book on a specific shelf in the Harold Washington Library, and he would leave his replies in another. It felt absurdly cloak and dagger, but the stakes were too high for a single mistake. With the tools in place, the real work began. For the next 5 months, I lived a double life that nearly broke me. By day, I was the perfect, diligent daughter, dutifully reconciling my father's fraudulent accounts. I'd smile in meetings, I'd fetch his coffee, I'd listen to his self-congratulatory stories, all while feeling like a viper was coiled in my gut. I had to be better than perfect. I had to be invisible. Any slip-up, any sign of distraction or distress could have given me away. At night, I became the Sentinel. I would come home to my apartment, my body buzzing with adrenaline and fear, and I'd get to work. I couldn't risk taking anything out of the office physically. The security was too tight, so I had to memorize. I would spend my days staring at spreadsheets, at wire transfer codes, at client account numbers, burning them into my memory. Then I would go to the restroom, lock myself in a stall, and type the data into a secure note-taking app on a burner phone Marcus had provided. It was painstaking, high-stakes work. Sometimes I would get a string of numbers wrong and have to spend the entire next day discreetly double-checking, my heart pounding every time someone walked past my cubicle. The real leverage came from my father's own arrogance. He was so confident in his control over the firm that his digital security was sloppy in places. He had a private server in his office where he kept his personal files, which I suspected was where the real dirt was. Getting access to it was the holy grail. I spent a month observing his habits. I knew he had a standing lunch every Thursday with a city alderman. He was always gone for exactly 90 minutes. That was my window. The day I did it, I thought I was going to have a heart attack. I waited until I saw him leave. Then I walked to his corner office. His assistant, a woman who had known me since I was a child, smiled at me. "Jules, honey, can I help you?" I gave her the most natural smile I could muster. "Dad forgot his favorite pen," I said, holding up a cheap ballpoint I'd palmed from the supply closet. "He's superstitious about signing things without it. He asked me to grab it." She waved me in without a second thought. "You know where it is." I walked into his office, the door clicking shut behind me. The air smelled of leather and his expensive cologne. My hands were slick with sweat. I had a USB drive, the one Marcus had configured to be a keylogger, disguised as a tube of lipstick in my pocket. I had 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes tops. I went to his desk, my movements stiff with terror. I knelt down behind it, out of sight of the door, and fumbled for the USB port on the back of his private server tower. My fingers were clumsy, shaking. I finally got it in. The tiny device started blinking. It was working. It would record every keystroke, every password he typed, until I could retrieve it. I pulled the cheap pen from his pen cup, walked back out, and gave his assistant a grateful smile. "Found it," I said, my voice an octave too high. She didn't notice. The next week was the longest of my life, waiting for the next Thursday lunch. Retrieving the device was even more terrifying than planting it, but I did it. That night, with Marcus on a secure video call guiding me, I plugged the lipstick tube into my burner laptop, and there it was, his master password. It was Eleanor_Legacy_1, my mother's name, and his favorite word. The sheer sentimental arrogance of it was breathtaking. With that password, I had everything. I had access to his shadow ledgers, the real ones that showed where all the money was going. I found the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I found the documents for the Shell Corporation. I found his personal notes, his strategies for luring in new candidates. It was a complete, unvarnished blueprint of his entire criminal career. I spent the next 2 months downloading it all, piece by piece, encrypting it, and saving it across multiple drives. I printed out the most damning documents and stored them in a safe deposit box I'd opened under a fake name. Finally, I was ready. I composed the first email to the SEC's public whistleblower tip line. It was short and to the point. I introduced myself as the Sentinel, an insider at a major Chicago investment firm. I stated that I had conclusive evidence of a long-running Ponzi scheme, defrauding hundreds of investors of over $500 million. I attached 3 documents, just enough to prove I was real: a falsified trade confirmation, a wire transfer to the Shell Corporation, and a page from his shadow ledger. I hit send, and my entire world went silent. The plan was in motion. The first move had been made. Now, all I could do was wait and see if the world's most powerful financial regulator would listen to a ghost. The waiting was a unique form of torture. For 3 weeks there was nothing. Every morning I'd wake up with a jolt of anxiety, check the encrypted email account, and find it empty. I started to spiral. Did they think it was a hoax? Was the evidence not compelling enough? Was my father so well protected that even the SEC was afraid to touch him? The silence was a void that my worst fears rushed to fill. At work, I tried to act normal, but the strain was immense. I felt like I was walking on a razor's edge. My father, oblivious, was in high spirits. He'd just closed a deal that brought in another $20 million of fresh money from a union pension fund. I saw the paperwork cross my desk, and I felt a fresh wave of sickness. More victims. The clock was ticking. Then one rainy Tuesday night, it happened. A reply. It was from a senior enforcement attorney in the SEC's Chicago office. His name was David Miller. The email was terse, professional, and electrifying. "We have reviewed the documents you provided. We find your claims credible. We need to establish a secure line of communication to discuss this further." I felt a dizzying rush of terror and vindication. They believed me. The machine was starting to turn. My communication with Agent Miller became the new rhythm of my life.
He was my handler, my confessor, my only link to the world where justice was possible. Our exchanges were always through the encrypted portal Marcus had built. Miller was cautious, methodical, and demanding. He never used my real name. I was always Sentinel. He'd ask for specific pieces of evidence. Sentinel, can you corroborate the outflow from the Rosewood portfolio for Q3 of last year? Sentinel, we need documentation of the initial capitalization of the offshore entity. Each request sent me back into the lion's den. I became a master of corporate espionage, using my lunch breaks and late nights to dive back into the servers, pulling the exact files he needed. Each successful retrieval felt like a small victory, another stone laid on the path to my father's ruin. About 2 months into this silent partnership, the first tremors were felt inside Davenport Capital. A letter arrived from the SEC announcing a routine audit. It was worded blandly, but it was anything but routine. My father stormed around the office, ranting about government overreach and bureaucratic red tape. They're just jealous of success, he bellowed to his senior partners. They want to slow us down, but they can't. He was putting on a brave face, but I could see the flicker of unease in his eyes. He didn't suspect a whistleblower, not yet. He thought it was just random, bad luck. But as the audit progressed, and the SEC's requests for information became more and more pointed, his unease curdled into genuine paranoia. He started holding late-night meetings, trying to cook the books to satisfy the auditors, creating a second, even more fraudulent set of records. What he didn't know was that I was recording everything. I used a tiny audio recorder disguised as a USB charger, which I'd leave plugged into the wall of the main conference room. I would retrieve it the next morning, my hands shaking as I listened to my father and his cronies openly discussing how to hide their crimes. I would transcribe the most damning parts and send them straight to Miller. I was giving the SEC a real-time play-by-play of the cover-up. This is when the silent takeover truly began. My father knew, with dawning horror, that the auditors were asking questions they shouldn't know to ask. They were targeting specific accounts, specific dates, specific transactions with surgical precision. He couldn't understand how. He started to believe there was a mole. The atmosphere in the office turned toxic. He started looking at everyone with suspicion. Old loyalties frayed. People who had been with him for decades were suddenly treated like potential traitors. And then came the most terrifying moment of the entire ordeal. He called me into his office one afternoon and closed the door. My blood ran cold. I thought, this is it, he knows. He sat behind his enormous desk, the picture of me and my brother as children smiling on the corner, and he looked at me with an expression of intense weary trust. Jules, he began, his voice low and conspiratorial, I need your help. There's a rat in this company. Someone is feeding information to the feds. I just stared at him, my face a carefully blank mask. I felt my heart hammering so hard I was sure he could see it moving, the fabric of my blouse. They're trying to destroy everything I've built, he continued, his voice thick with self-pity. Everything I've built for you and Evan, for this family. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into mine. You're the only one I can trust. You're smart, you see everything. I want you to go through the email servers, go through personnel files. I want you to find them for me, find the snake in our garden. I sat there frozen, as my father, the man I was systematically destroying, tasked me with finding myself. The irony was so profound, so grotesque, it was almost funny. I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in my throat, and had to swallow it down. I looked at him, at his desperate, trusting face, and I gave him the most loyal, earnest nod I could manage. Of course, Dad, I said, my voice steady, I'll find them. I won't let you down. I walked out of his office, a traitor newly commissioned as a spy hunter, and the weight of my deception felt like it was going to crush me. But I also felt a surge of cold power. He had just given his enemy the keys to the kingdom. He was so blinded by his perception of me as the quiet, loyal daughter, that he couldn't see the executioner standing right in front of him. The weeks leading up to the gala were a slow-motion collapse. My father's paranoia, fueled by the relentless surgical precision of the SEC's inquiries, began to consume him. He was a man watching his house flood, unable to find the source of the leak. He saw traitors everywhere. His first casualty was his oldest friend and business partner, a man named George. George had been with him since the beginning. He was a decent man, I think, but one who had gotten rich by choosing not to look too closely at the details. My father, in a fit of baseless suspicion, accused George of being the mole. I knew this because I had recorded the entire brutal confrontation from the conference room. My father had screamed at him, called him a backstabbing coward. George, shocked and deeply wounded, had packed up his office and left that same day, ending a 30-year partnership. That was the first crack in the dam. This was the beginning of what I think of as the family exodus. It wasn't a physical departure, but an emotional one. The carefully constructed world of the Davenports began to disintegrate under the pressure. The biggest shift was in my mother. Eleanor had built her identity on being Mrs. Richard Davenport. She was the queen of a kingdom, built on my father's success. As his paranoia and temper worsened, the kingdom started to feel less like a palace, and more like a bunker. He was short with her, dismissive. He stopped attending the charity functions and social events that were the cornerstones of her life. He was home less, and when he was either locked in his study or pacing the penthouse like a caged animal.
Her world was shrinking, and it terrified her. One evening she called me, her voice thin and strained. "Juliet, you need to talk to your father," she said, without any preamble. "He's not himself. He's alienating everyone. George is gone. Can you believe that?" "George? He's under a lot of stress, Mom," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "This is more than stress," she snapped, a rare note of hysteria in her voice. "This is destructive. People are talking. What's going on at the firm? Is everything all right?" This was my chance. A small part of me wanted to tell her, to unload the burden, to have an ally, to have my mother back. But I knew better. I knew her question wasn't born of a search for truth, but a search for reassurance. She didn't want to know if something was wrong. She wanted to be told that everything was fine. So I lied. "It's just this SEC audit," I said calmly. "It's a nuisance, but Dad will handle it. He always does." She seized on it, her relief palpable. "Of course he will. You're right. It's just, you need to support him, Juliet. This family has to present a united front. More than ever, he needs his loyal daughter by his side." It was her desperate counter-manipulation, her attempt to pull me back into the fold, to shore up the crumbling walls of her reality. She was reminding me of my role. Be quiet, be supportive, be loyal, don't ask questions. Her plea didn't feel like a mother's concern. It felt like a queen, ordering a guard to her post. The power shift between us was subtle but profound. For my entire life, her approval had been a currency I desperately sought. Now hearing the panic in her voice, I realized I didn't need it anymore. I had a purpose that was bigger than her comfort. My silence in that moment, my calm detachment, seemed to unnerve her more than any argument would have. She was used to me being compliant. My newfound placidness was something she couldn't read, and it frightened her. The final piece of the power shift came from Agent Miller. A week before the gala, he sent me a message. "Sentinel, we have everything we need. The commission has voted to proceed with formal charges. The U.S. Attorney's Office is filing for an arrest warrant. We are ready to move. We believe he is a significant flight risk and may begin destroying evidence imminently. The arrest needs to happen soon." Then he asked a question I wasn't expecting. "We know he is being honored at the Financial Guild Gala next Friday. A public arrest would send a powerful message, but it would also be a public spectacle for the family. Do you have a preference on the timing and location?" He was giving me a choice. He was giving Juliet Davenport, the daughter, a say in how her father's life ended. It was a small professional courtesy, but it felt like a monumental transfer of power. I could have let them arrest him quietly, at the office on a Monday morning. I could have spared my mother the public humiliation. I could have been merciful. I thought about it for a full day. I thought about the Hendersons, the retired teachers. I thought about Mrs. Gable, the librarian. I thought about my father's predatory notes about them being prime candidates. I thought about his speech on honor at my Little League game. I thought about his smirking face on the cover of magazines, a testament to a life built on lies. A quiet arrest would allow him to spin it, to control the narrative, to disappear behind a wall of lawyers, and emerge years later, unrepentant. He deserved to have the edifice of his lies torn down in the same place he had built it, in public, under the bright, adoring lights, in front of everyone he had fooled. I wrote back to Agent Miller. "The gala is the perfect venue. He needs to be stopped, and the world needs to see it." It wasn't about revenge. I told myself one last time, it was about justice. But as I typed the words, I knew I was lying to myself. At this point, it was about revenge. It was about taking everything from him, just as he had taken everything from them, and it was going to be spectacular. The night of the gala, I moved through the ballroom like a ghost in a dream. Every conversation, every burst of laughter, every chime of a champagne glass sounded distant and muted, as if I were listening to it all from underwater. I was a vessel of pure cold calm. The Sentinel was in control now. I watched my father work the room, a king holding court. He was incandescently happy, a man at the absolute pinnacle of his life, completely unaware that he was standing on a trapdoor. My mother was floating at his side, radiant in a silver gown, her earlier anxieties washed away by the sheer glamour of the evening. She caught my eye and gave me a brilliant, relieved smile, a look that said, "See, I told you everything would be fine." I smiled back, a perfect hollow replica of a daughter's affection. When the time came for the award, a hush fell over the room. The president of the Financial Guild gave a gushing introduction, listing my father's supposed accomplishments, his contributions to the city, his unwavering integrity. I had to clench my fists under the table to keep from laughing. Then my father walked to the stage to a thunderous standing ovation. I stood up with everyone else, my applause soft and soundless. He took the heavy crystal award, a gleaming obelisk, and held it up to the light. He beamed, his eyes sweeping across the adoring crowd. He looked exactly like the man on the magazine covers, powerful, untouchable. He cleared his throat and began his speech. "Thank you," he said, his voice resonating with practiced sincerity. "I am truly humbled. When I founded Davenport Capital 30 years ago, I had a simple vision: to build a firm based on two core principles, trust and integrity." My eyes flickered to the grand ballroom doors at the back of the room. Nothing yet. I felt a prickle of anxiety. What if something had gone wrong? "Trust," he continued, leaning into the microphone, "is the bedrock of our business. It's a sacred bond between us and our clients. They place their futures in our hands, their dreams, their legacies, and we have a profound moral obligation to honor that trust." I saw him, Agent Miller. He had just stepped through the doors, flanked by two other agents in dark suits. They were calm, almost unnervingly so. They didn't rush, they just began walking, moving with purpose through the maze of tables, their path a straight, unwavering line to the stage. A few people at the back turned to look, a ripple of confusion spreading through the room. My father hadn't noticed them yet. He was in his element, lost in his own performance. "And integrity," he said, his voice swelling with emotion. "Integrity means doing the right thing, even when no one is watching. It's about building a legacy that will stand the test of time, a legacy I can be proud to pass on to my children." As he said the word children, his eyes found mine in the crowd. He gave me a small private smile, a moment of connection just between us. In that instant, for a fraction of a second, I felt a pang of something sharp and painful, a ghost of the love I used to have for him. And then he saw them. The agents were halfway to the stage now, and the ripple of confusion had become a wave of silence. The people in their path parted instinctively. My father's smile faltered. He squinted slightly, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He thought they were security, perhaps coming to deal with some disturbance. He tried to continue. "A legacy of..." He trailed off. The agents had reached the foot of the stage. Agent Miller didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. He simply said, in a voice that carried in the sudden dead silence of the hall, "Richard Davenport." My father stared at him, bewildered. "Yes, you are under arrest by federal authorities for securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering." The words dropped into the room, like stones into a silent pond. A collective gasp went through the crowd. I saw my mother's face, her smile frozen, her eyes wide with uncomprehending horror. My father looked like he had been slapped. His face went from confusion to disbelief, to a dark crimson rage. "This is absurd," he blustered into the microphone. "There has been a mistake. Do you know who I am?" The second agent was already walking up the steps to the stage. "Sir, please put your hands behind your back." And then came the moment of vindication. It wasn't the sound of the handcuffs clicking into place, though that was satisfying. It wasn't the sight of the reporters in the back, suddenly scrambling, their cameras flashing. It was the look in my father's eyes. As the agent took his arm, my father's gaze swept desperately across the room, across the sea of shocked and horrified faces. And it landed, once again, on me. And in that final silent confrontation, across a ballroom filled with the wreckage of his life,
I let the mask drop, just for a second. I didn't smile, I didn't smirk, I just let him see. I let him see the cold, clear, unyielding knowledge in my eyes. I let him see the Sentinel, his face already a mask of rage, morphed into something new, a dawning sickening understanding. The blood drained from his face. It wasn't a guess, it wasn't a suspicion. In that moment, he knew. He knew that the snake in his garden, the author of his destruction, was his own quiet, loyal daughter. The look of utter betrayal on his face was more devastating than any prison sentence could ever be. They led him off the stage, past my mother who had crumpled into her chair, a silent, sobbing ruin. He never took his eyes off me, and as they walked him out of the ballroom, and out of my life forever, I took my first full, deep, liberating breath in 6 months. The performance was over. The aftermath was exactly what you'd expect. A media firestorm. The story of Richard Davenport's spectacular fall from grace was on every news channel, every newspaper front page. The titan of Chicago finance, arrested for running a massive Ponzi scheme at his own awards ceremony. It was a story almost too perfect to be true. The press, of course, hunted for the whistleblower. They speculated it was a disgruntled partner, a rival, an angry ex-employee. They called the Sentinel a hero, a modern-day deep throat of the financial world. No one ever once mentioned the quiet, unassuming daughter, who was seen leaving the gala in a state of quiet shock, leaning on the arm of a family friend. I played my part to the very end. Davenport Capital was dissolved. The courts appointed a receiver to liquidate every asset my father owned, the firm, the penthouse, the vacation homes, the art collection, the cars. It all went into a fund for the victims. It was a staggering amount of money, but divided among the hundreds he had defrauded, it came out to less than 30 cents on the dollar. It wasn't justice, not really. You can't restore a person's future with a partial refund, but it was something. I made sure the receiver had the contact information for the Hendersons, for Mrs. Gable, for all the prime candidates, whose lives he had shattered. I heard through the lawyers that Mrs. Gable was able to get enough back to avoid losing her small condo, which was a small mercy in a sea of devastation. My mother was a wreck. Her entire world had been a mirage, and when it vanished, she was left with nothing. She refused to believe my father was guilty. Then she refused to believe he knew the extent of it. She cycled through every stage of denial. She tried to reach out to me, to pull me into her orbit of grief and delusion, for us to be a family against the world. I couldn't do it. I met with her once, in a sterile coffee shop. She begged me to help with the legal defense fund. She asked me to make a public statement in support of him. I looked at her, at this woman who chose comfort over truth her entire life, and I felt nothing but a deep, sorrowful pity. I told her I couldn't. I told her I needed to move on. She called me cold, ungrateful, a traitor to my own blood. Maybe she was right. I quit my job the day after the arrest. I packed up my apartment, put my things in storage, and I bought a one-way ticket to a small coastal town in Oregon I'd only ever seen in pictures. I needed the ocean. I needed to be somewhere where no one knew the name Davenport. I gave Marcus a significant portion of my savings, a consulting fee, I called it. He tried to refuse, but I insisted. For your grandmother, I told him. He understood. So here I am. It's been a year. My life is quiet now. I work part-time in a local library, a strange cosmic echo. I'm still trying to understand. I read a lot. I walk on the beach. The Sentinel is gone, retired. Sometimes at night, I think about my father. He took a plea bargain to avoid a trial that would have aired every last one of his secrets. He's serving a 25-year sentence in a federal correctional institution. I don't know if I'll ever see him again. I don't know if I want to. And I have to ask myself, was it worth it? The answer is never simple. I destroyed my family. I orchestrated my own father's ruin. I carry the weight of that choice every single day. There's a profound loneliness that comes with being the sole keeper of such a massive secret. But then I think about the alternative. I think about the corrosive poison of silence. I think about what it would have meant to stand by and do nothing, to be the quiet, loyal daughter, while hundreds of innocent people had their lives destroyed. And I realize loyalty is a complicated thing. Is it loyalty to a person, or to the principles that person is supposed to represent? My father taught me about integrity, and in the end, I chose to honor the lesson, not the man. It wasn't a choice between family and justice. It was a choice to define what family and justice are supposed to mean. He saw me as a possession, a reflection of his own glory. He never saw me as a person with my own moral compass, and that was his fatal mistake. Some foundations are built on lies, and they don't deserve to stand. They deserve to crumble, and sometimes you have to be the one to light the fuse. I guess what I want to say is we all have a choice. We can accept the roles we're given, or we can become who we need to be. It's the hardest thing in the world, but it's also the only thing that's real. Thank you for listening to my story. It's not an easy one to tell, but it feels important to share. If you've ever been in a situation where your loyalty was tested, or where you had to make an impossible choice, I hope my story gives you a little bit of strength. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll be reading them. And if you found this story compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more content like this. It really helps more than you know. Thanks again for being here.